The year was 1887, and the prairie land that held Arthur Prescott's homestead seemed to have swallowed all sound. Silence was the currency of his days, a heavy blanket woven from grief and neglect. It pressed down from the enormous, indifferent sky and rose up from the fallow earth. His farm, once a testament to hope and hard work, was now a portrait of his own heart, broken, barren, and slowly surrendering to the wild. The fences sagged like tired shoulders, the field nearest the cabin was choked with thistle and defiant weeds, and the small barn listed to one side, as if exhausted by the effort of standing. Each sunrise was a fresh accusation. Arthur would rise from his cold bed, the empty space beside him a physical ache, and move through the two-room cabin that still echoed with a life that was no longer his. He saw the ghost of his wife, Martha, her hands dusted with flour by the hearth. He heard the phantom cry of his infant son, a sound that had once been the axis of his world and was now a shard of glass in his memory. They had been taken by a fever in the winter of 1885, a cruel, swift reaping that had left him the sole haunted survivor on this patch of unforgiving land. His chores were a mechanical routine, performed with the grim efficiency of a man running on memory alone. He drew water from the well, fed the two skeletal cows and the handful of chickens that had survived his apathy, and then he would often just stand, his gaze lost on the horizon where the land met the sky in a seamless, lonely line. The will to plow, to plant, to build had been buried with his family. He was a farmer who had forgotten the purpose of a harvest. Loneliness was not just a feeling, it was the very air he breathed, the taste of the water he drank. He was a man whittled down to the bone, waiting for the wind and the dust to carry him away. It was on a blistering afternoon in late June, when the sun beat down with a blacksmith's fury, that the silence was finally broken. He was walking the edge of his property, following the thin ribbon of a creek that offered the only real green in the parched landscape, his mind a familiar landscape of numb sorrow. He was not looking for anything, merely moving because stillness felt too much like lying in a grave. And then he saw it, a splash of color against the dun-colored grass that was wrong. Not the faded blue of a prairie flower or the brown of a stone, but the deep reds and blues of patterned fabric. He approached with the caution of a man long accustomed to solitude. Lying near the water's edge, half hidden by overgrown reeds, was a woman. She was native, her heritage clear in the high line of her cheekbones and the straight, blue-black hair that fanned out around her head like spilled ink. She was unconscious, her face pale beneath its sun-warmed tone. A dark, ugly gash marred her temple, matted with blood and dirt. Her deerskin dress was torn at the shoulder and hem, and she wore no moccasins. She was utterly still, a broken doll discarded by a careless hand. Arthur's first instinct was pure, unthinking avoidance. This was a trouble he did not need, a complication his fragile peace could not withstand. He could walk away, no one would ever know. The wilderness swallowed secrets every day. He took a half-step back, his heart a cold stone in his chest. But then a small, involuntary sound escaped her lips, a soft moan of pain that was so profoundly human it cut through the thick calluses around his soul. It was the sound of suffering, and it was a language he understood intimately. He stood frozen for a long moment, a war raging within him. Taking her to the nearest town, a good day's ride away, was unthinkable. They would see her race before they saw her wound. They would ask questions he could not answer, and offer a brand of help that felt more like a cage. Leaving her here was a death sentence. That left only one option, an option that made every nerve in his body scream in protest. To bring her into his home, into the silent, sacred space of his grief. With a groan that was part resignation, part self-recrimination, he knelt. He was not a gentleman, not anymore, but he tried to be. He slipped one arm beneath her shoulders and the other under her knees. She was lighter than he expected, yet she felt like the heaviest burden he had ever lifted. As he straightened, her head lolled against his shoulder, her breath a warm whisper against his neck. He carried her back toward the cabin, his boots crunching on the dry earth, each step feeling like a betrayal of the solitude he had so carefully cultivated. He was bringing life into a house of ghosts, and he had no idea if any of them would survive it. He laid her on his own bed, the first person to touch the quilt since Martha had stitched its final seam. For a moment, seeing her dark hair against the pale fabric was a shock so profound it nearly sent him reeling. He backed away, his breath catching in his throat. He retrieved the cot from the barn, the one he'd intended for a hired hand, he never hired, and set it up in the corner of the main room. After a moment's hesitation, he moved her there, feeling a small measure of relief as he restored the sanctity of his own bed. Her wound needed tending. He washed it as best he could with water from the basin and a clean rag, his movements clumsy and uncertain. The gash was deep, but it had stopped bleeding. He found an old bottle of whiskey and, after a moment's debate, poured a little on the cloth and dabbed at the edges of the cut. She flinched violently in her unconscious state, a sharp intake of breath, but did not wake. He found some clean linen and fashioned a crude bandage around her head. Then there was nothing left to do but wait. He sat in his worn wooden chair across the room, his shotgun laid across his knees, and watched her. The sun bled out of the sky, painting the cabin in shades of orange and purple before darkness consumed it all. He did not light a lamp. He sat in the dark, listening to the alien sound of another person's breathing. He was a warden in his own home, guarding a prisoner who was also his patient. He did not know her name, her tribe, her story. He only knew that she was here, a disruption, a question mark laid across the bleak, predictable sentence of his life. She awoke near dawn. He was dozing in the chair, his head slumped to his chest, when a small sound jolted him to full awareness. Her eyes were open. They were the color of dark, wet earth, and they were filled with a terror so pure it was like a physical force in the room. When she saw him, saw the shotgun still resting on his lap, she scrambled backward on the cot, pressing herself into the rough-hewn logs of the wall, a trapped animal looking for an escape that did not exist. "Easy," he said, his voice a rusty croak. He raised his hands slowly, setting the shotgun on the floor beside him. "I'm not going to hurt you." She stared at him, her chest rising and falling rapidly. The words meant nothing to her. He could see that in the uncomprehending fear in her eyes. He tried again, using simple gestures. He pointed to the water bucket, then to his own mouth, raising his eyebrows in a question. She just watched him, her gaze flicking from his face to the door and back again. She was a taut wire of fear. He rose slowly and ladled some water into a tin cup. He approached her as one might a wild horse, slowly, with no sudden movements. He held the cup out. For a long moment, she did not move. Her eyes searched his face, looking for a threat, a trick. Finally, propelled by a thirst that must have been agonizing, she reached out a trembling hand and took it. She drank greedily, her throat working, and when it was empty, she held it out for more. That was how their communication began, a language of necessity, of gestures and pointing. He learned she would eat the cornbread he made, but not the salted pork. He learned she was fastidious, keeping her small corner of the cabin neat, folding the single blanket he'd given her with precise care each morning. And he learned she had no memory. He discovered this on the third day. He had tried pointing to himself and saying his name, Arthur. He then pointed to her, a questioning look on his face. She simply stared back, her brow furrowed in a confusion that went deeper than language. A profound, hollow emptiness swam in her eyes. She touched the bandage on her head, then looked at her own hands as if they belonged to a stranger. She did not know who she was. The blow that had stolen her consciousness had also stolen her past. She was adrift, an island in her own mind. He felt a strange, unwelcome pang of pity. To be so utterly alone, not even having the company of one's own history, was a desolation he could scarcely imagine. He had to call her something. He thought for a long time, watching her as she sat by the window, her gaze fixed on the endless prairie. It was her eyes that held him. They were so watchful, so observant, taking in everything with a quiet intensity. He had once read a book about the Lakota people, and a word surfaced from the recesses of his memory. "Istas," he said quietly one evening. She turned her head, her expression questioning. He pointed to her. "Istas." He didn't know if it was right, or even if she was Lakota, but it felt better than calling her woman in his own head. Her expression didn't change, but she did not look away. It was a name, a sound to anchor her to the present. For now, it would have to be enough. The first weeks were a silent, watchful truce. They moved around each other in the small cabin like two planets held in a reluctant orbit, close enough to feel the pull but never touching. He went about his minimal chores, and she stayed inside, her strength slowly returning. He would find her watching him, her dark eyes missing nothing. He felt exposed under that gaze, as if she could see the rot in his soul, the places where his grief had eaten him away. Then, one morning, something shifted. He went out to the neglected vegetable patch, a place Martha had tended with such love, and stared at the jungle of weeds that had strangled the life out of it. He lacked the heart to even begin. He turned away in disgust and saw Ista standing in the doorway of the cabin, watching him. After a moment, she walked out, her bare feet silent on the earth. She knelt down and, with a fluid, practiced motion, began to pull the weeds, her slender fingers discerning between the invaders and the few struggling squash vines with an innate certainty. He just stood there, stunned into stillness. He had offered her shelter, and now she was offering him work. It was a trade, an unspoken agreement. He watched for a few minutes, a complex mixture of shame and something else, something like gratitude stirring in his chest. Then, grabbing a hoe, he knelt in the dirt on the other side of the patch and began to work alongside her. They did not speak. The only sounds were the rustle of uprooted weeds, the thud of the hoe, and the buzzing of insects. But it was a shared silence, not an empty one. For the first time in 2 years, he was not alone in his labor. For the first time in 2 years, the work did not feel entirely pointless. This became their new routine. Ista seemed to possess a deep, instinctual knowledge of the land. She found edible roots he had never known existed. She showed him how to use the leaves of a particular plant to create a poultice that he applied to her healing head wound, and it seemed to work better than his whiskey had. She moved with a quiet purpose that was a stark contrast to his own leaden aimlessness. One day he found her standing by the collapsed section of the corral fence. She was examining the broken posts, her head tilted. When she saw him, she pointed to the woods at the edge of his property, then made a chopping motion with her hands. He understood. She was telling him they needed new timber. It was a simple suggestion, but to Arthur it was a revelation. She saw a broken thing, and her first thought was to mend it. He had been looking at that same broken fence for months, and had seen only an ending. They went into the woods together, him with his axe, her with a small hatchet she'd found in the barn. She was a natural in the forest, moving with a grace and silence that made him feel loud and clumsy. She pointed out the best trees, straight and strong. As he swung the heavy axe, the physical exertion a welcome punishment, he could feel her eyes on him. It wasn't a judgmental gaze, but one of steady observation. It made him want to stand taller, to swing the axe cleaner. They worked side by side, day after day, and the farm began to breathe again. They mended the fence, cleared the larger field, and even repaired the leaning wall of the barn. Her presence was a quiet catalyst, shaming him out of his inertia. He started waking not with dread, but with a sense of purpose. There were things to be done. There was someone who expected him to do them. The silence between them also began to change. It softened, becoming a space of comfortable companionship. He found himself talking to her, filling the quiet with the sound of his own voice. He didn't know if she understood the words, but she listened. She would turn her head, her dark eyes fixed on him, and he felt heard in a way he hadn't in a very long time. This was supposed to be a good field for corn, he told her one afternoon as they rested, looking out over the patch of land they had just cleared. Martha, she always said this soil had a sweetness to it. He stopped, surprised at how easily his wife's name had slipped out. He hadn't spoken it aloud to another soul since the funeral. Istas did not speak, of course, but she turned her gaze from the field to his face. There was a depth of compassion in her eyes, an ancient understanding of loss that seemed to exist beyond language or memory. She did not need to understand the word Martha to understand the shape of the hole it left in his voice. He began to see her not as the mysterious, wounded stranger, but as Istas. He saw the way her mouth curved in a slight, almost smile when one of the chickens did something foolish. He saw the fierce concentration in her eyes when she was weaving dried grasses into a tight, functional basket. He saw the deep sadness that sometimes clouded her features when she looked toward the distant horizon, a fleeting glimpse of the immense loss she carried without even knowing what it was. One evening, a cool breeze drifted through the open door, carrying the scent of rain. He was repairing a piece of tack, his hands clumsy with the needle and awl. Istas was sitting by the fire, mending one of his work shirts. The needle moved in her fingers with a speed and precision he could only envy. As she worked, she began to hum. It was not a tune he recognized, but a low, mournful melody that seemed to rise from the very earth itself. It was a song of sorrow, but also of resilience. It filled the small cabin, weaving itself into the flickering firelight, and for the first time, the space did not feel haunted, it felt full. He stopped his work and just listened, his heart aching with a strange, sweet pain. The song was a lament for all that was lost or past, his family, their shared solitude. But it was also a testament to what remained. Two lonely souls finding a strange and fragile harmony in a broken-down cabin on the vast, indifferent prairie. He looked at her, at the firelight catching the sharp, beautiful lines of her face, and realized with a jolt that he was no longer just enduring her presence. He was grateful for it. The summer wore on, and their shared labor bore fruit. The garden was thriving, a riot of green and yellow against the dark earth. The corn in the main field was growing tall and strong. The farm was slowly coming back to life, and so was Arthur. The hollow ache in his chest was still there, but it was no longer a gaping void. It was as if Istas's quiet, steady presence had begun to fill in the cracks, not by replacing what was lost, but by building something new alongside it. But the world was larger than his 160 acres. The salt pork was gone, the flour was low, and he needed nails. The town of redemption, a place he had avoided like the plague, was a necessity he could no longer postpone. The thought of it coiled in his gut. The prying eyes, the thinly veiled questions, the memory of returning from it last time to find the doctor shaking his head on his porch. An even more pressing problem was what to do about Istas. He couldn't leave her alone for 2 days. What if she wandered off? What if her people, or whoever had hurt her, came looking for her? The thought sent a cold spike of fear through him. But taking her with him, that was a different kind of danger. He had seen how men in town looked at things they considered exotic or unclaimed. He tried to explain with gestures, drawing a crude map of the town in the dirt, pointing to the wagon. She watched him, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she simply stood up, walked to the cabin, and emerged a moment later with the shawl she had woven from spare wool. She draped it over her head and shoulders and stood by the wagon, waiting. The decision had been made. The ride to redemption was tense. Arthur kept glancing at her, sitting silently on the wagon seat beside him. She looked smaller, more vulnerable, out here in the open world. As they drew closer to the town, he could feel the change in the air. The quiet companionship of the farm was replaced by a growing sense of unease. Redemption was a dusty main street lined with false-fronted buildings. As they pulled up to the general store, the world seemed to stop and stare. Men leaning on porch posts fell silent. Women fetching water stopped to watch, their faces hardening into masks of disapproval. It was exactly as he had feared. He was the town recluse, the man broken by grief, and now he had appeared with a silent native woman at his side. The whispers started before his boots even hit the ground. "Arthur," the storekeeper, Mr. Hale, said, his eyes flicking nervously from Arthur to Istus, who remained on the wagon. "Been a while." "Need supplies, Henry," Arthur said, his voice flat, trying to keep the interaction as normal as possible. He rattled off his list, keenly aware of the other customers in the store who were pretending not to listen. As Hale weighed out the flour, a voice boomed from the doorway. "Well, well, look what the wind blew in, Prescott. I heard you'd gone to seed out on that sorry excuse for a farm." Arthur didn't need to turn to know who it was. Garrett Vance, a man whose arrogance was matched only by his cruelty. Vance owned the largest ranch in the county and acted as if he owned the town too. Vance sauntered in, his spurs jingling on the floorboards. He stopped, his gaze falling on the wagon outside. A slow, ugly smirk spread across his face. "And it looks like you've picked up a stray. Where'd you find that one, Prescott? She run off from the reservation." Arthur's hand tightened into a fist at his side. "That's none of your business, Vance." "Oh, I think it is," Vance said, taking a step closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial leer. "It's the business of every God-fearing man in this town to know what sort of company is being kept. Can't have savages running loose. It ain't safe." His eyes were fixed on Istus, a predatory gleam in them that made Arthur's blood run cold. "She's with me," Arthur said, his voice low and dangerous. He stepped in front of Vance, blocking his view. "She's under my protection. Now back away." For a tense moment, the two men locked eyes. Vance was bigger, heavier, with two of his ranch hands flanking him. But something in Arthur's face here, cold, unshakable resolve he hadn't felt in years, made Vance hesitate. It was the look of a man who had nothing left to lose and had just found something worth defending. Vance laughed, a short, barking sound. "Protective, are we? Fine. Keep your pet. But when she puts a knife in your back, don't come crying to us." He spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the floor near Arthur's feet, then turned and swaggered out of the store, his men following like dogs. Arthur paid for his supplies in shaking silence, loaded the wagon, and got them out of that town as fast as he could. The ride back was heavy with the unspoken ugliness of the encounter. He glanced at Istus. She was staring straight ahead, her face a stoic mask, but he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands were clenched tightly in her lap. She had understood the venom, if not the words. He had brought her into his world, and his world had tried to tear her down. A fierce, protective anger surged through him, an emotion so potent it surprised him. It was an anger on her behalf, but also on his own. Vance and the others had looked at them and seen something dirty, something wrong. They couldn't imagine that what they were seeing was two broken people trying to piece together a life. When they were nearly home, he pulled the wagon to a stop. He turned to her. "I'm sorry," he said, the words feeling inadequate. "For that, for them." She finally looked at him. Her eyes searched his face, and then she did something that stunned him. She reached out and briefly, gently, laid her hand on his forearm. It was the first time she had touched him voluntarily, a simple gesture of acknowledgement, of solidarity. It said, "I saw you stand for me." In that moment, the line between protector and protected blurred. They were in this together. The threat had not driven them apart, it had bound them closer. The confrontation in town cast a long shadow. A week passed, but the peace they had cultivated on the farm felt fragile, threatened. Arthur found himself watching the horizon more, not with emptiness, but with vigilance. He kept the shotgun cleaned and loaded by the door. The unspoken ugliness with Vance felt like a storm that had not yet broken. It broke on a Tuesday. The sky was a bruised, heavy purple, promising a thunderstorm. Arthur was securing the door on the chicken coop when he heard the drumming of hoofbeats, too many for a lone rider. He straightened up, his heart sinking. 3 men on horseback were approaching, their figures stark against the darkening landscape. It was Garrett Vance, flanked by the same two thuggish ranch hands. Istus appeared in the cabin doorway, her face pale. Arthur gave her a sharp look. "Get inside, lock the door." She hesitated, her eyes wide with fear, but she obeyed, the bolt sliding home with a heavy thud. Arthur walked calmly to the porch, picked up his shotgun, and cradled it in his arms. He stood at the top of the 3 shallow steps and waited. The men reined in their horses a dozen yards from the cabin, the animals snorting and stamping in the electric air. "Evening, Prescott," Vance called out, his voice slick with false civility. "We've come about the woman." "There's nothing to talk about," Arthur said, his voice steady, betraying none of the fear churning in his stomach. "Oh, I think there is," Vance sneered. "Folks are concerned. A lone Indian woman, miles from the reservation. It's not right. We figure she's a runaway. We're just here to take her back where she belongs. Doing our civic duty." The lie was so thin it was transparent. Their eyes were hungry, not with civic duty, but with a brutish desire for power and control. They wanted to take her because she was vulnerable and because he had dared to defend her. "She's not going anywhere," Arthur said. "She stays here. This is her home." The words came out before he'd even consciously formed them, and he realized with startling clarity that they were true. This place, this broken farm, was her home now, and his. Vance laughed, a sound as ugly as his smirk. "Her home? Don't be a fool, Prescott. She's a savage. You can't trust her. We're doing you a favor." He began to dismount. "Now, are you going to step aside, or do we have to move you?" The air crackled, thick with menace. The first fat drops of rain began to fall. "You're not touching her," Arthur said, raising the shotgun so it pointed squarely at Vance's chest. "You want her, you'll have to come through me, and I promise you, Vance, at least one of you won't be riding home." The moment stretched, taut and deadly. Vance's men shifted uneasily, their bravado faltering in the face of Arthur's cold, deadly calm. He was no longer the town's broken recluse. He was a man defending his home, defending the only thing that had made his life worth living again. Just then, the cabin door creaked open. Istus stepped out onto the porch. She did not cower or hide behind him. She walked to his side, her back straight, her chin high. She looked at Vance and his men, her dark eyes burning with a fire that had nothing to do with fear. It was a blaze of pure, defiant spirit. She had no memory of who she was, but she knew what she was not. She was not a prize to be taken. She was not a thing to be owned. Her presence at his side sent a surge of strength through Arthur. They stood together, 2 solitary figures against the 3 mounted men, against the coming storm, against the entire world's prejudice and cruelty. Istus's quiet courage was a shield. Vance stared, momentarily thrown. He had expected a cowering squaw, not this proud, unflinching woman. He had expected a broken farmer, not this resolute guardian. The risk of the fight suddenly seemed much higher, the reward less certain. He was a bully, not a killer, and he saw in Arthur's eyes a man who would pull the trigger. "You're a bigger fool than I thought, Prescott." Vance spat, his voice laced with venom as he swung himself back into the saddle. "When you end up dead in a ditch, remember I tried to warn you." He wheeled his horse around, digging his spurs in cruelly, and galloped away, his men scrambling to follow. Their retreat was as ugly as their arrival. Arthur and Istus stood on the porch, watching until they were just small specks swallowed by the twilight and the rain. The shotgun felt immensely heavy in Arthur's hands. He lowered it, his whole body trembling with the adrenaline crash. The rain was coming down in earnest now, a hard, cleansing downpour. He turned to Istus. Her face was streaked with rain, her expression unreadable but for the tremor in her chin. The terror she had held at bay was finally surfacing. He didn't think, he acted. He reached out and pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly against him. She was stiff for a moment, surprised. Then she melted against him, her hands gripping the back of his shirt. He could feel her shuddering, and he just held on, shielding her from the storm, his chin resting on the top of her wet hair. They stood there for a long time as the rain washed over them, a silent testament to the battle they had just won together. The external threat was gone, and in its place, the final wall between their hearts had crumbled into dust. In the quiet aftermath of the storm, both the one in the sky and the one in their yard, the cabin felt like a sanctuary. The fire crackled in the hearth, chasing the damp chill from their bones. They sat in silence for a long time, the shared danger having stripped away any need for pretense. The bond between them, forged in shared work and quiet understanding, had been tempered in the fire of confrontation and was now unbreakable. Arthur looked at Istus, who was staring into the flames, her profile softened by the flickering light. He knew he had to tell her. He had to give her the final, broken piece of himself so they could truly be whole together. "My wife's name was Martha," he began, his voice rough with emotion. She built this place with me. Her hands planted the garden you saved. Her laugh used to fill this room." He paused, the words tasting strange and painful on his tongue. "We had a son. We only had him for 3 months. His name was Thomas." He spoke their names, and the ghosts that had haunted the corners of the cabin did not swell with menace. Instead, it felt as if they drew near to listen, to finally be acknowledged. He told her everything. He told her about the fever, about the helplessness of watching them fade, about the crushing, silent weight of the 2 years that had followed. He spoke of the emptiness, the farm's decay mirroring his own. He confessed his own brokenness, laying his soul bare in the warm, fire-lit room. When he finished, his voice was hoarse, and a single tear he hadn't known was there traced a path through the grime on his cheek. Istus turned her head to look at him. Her eyes were deep pools of empathy. She did not offer empty words of comfort, for she had none to give. Instead, she reached out a gentle hand, and with her thumb, brushed the tear from his face. It was a gesture of such profound, simple kindness that it broke through the last of his defenses. He wept then, not the silent, desperate tears of a man alone, but the cleansing, healing tears of a man who was finally seen. Life on the farm found a new rhythm, a new equilibrium. It was a life built for two. They worked the fields together, their movements synchronized in a comfortable dance of shared labor. The harvest that autumn was bountiful, the corn thick on the stalk, the garden overflowing. It felt like a miracle, a testament to what could be mended with patience and care. Istus's memory never returned. There were moments when a shadow would cross her face as she heard a particular bird call or saw a certain pattern in the clouds, a flicker of a life she could not grasp. But the past remained a locked door. It ceased to matter. She had found her identity not in who she had been, but in who she was now. A skilled and resilient woman, the quiet, steady heart of their shared world. She began to smile more, a slow, radiant unfolding that could light up the entire cabin. She even began to speak, tentative at first, echoing words he used. Water, fire, home. Each one was a gift. Arthur, in turn, was transformed. The grief for Martha and Thomas would always be a part of him, a quiet ache beneath the surface, but it no longer defined him. It was a scar, not a wound. He learned to live again, to find joy in the simple things, the warmth of the sun on his face, the taste of the bread Istus baked, the sound of her soft humming as they sat on the porch in the evenings. They had rebuilt the farm, but more than that, they had rebuilt a home. They had taken 2 broken lives and countless shattered pieces, and, with unexpected kindness and stubborn resilience, they had created something new, something strong. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and gold, they sat on the repaired porch steps, looking out over the fields they had brought back to life. A comfortable silence settled between them, no longer a void but a space filled with unspoken understanding and deep, abiding affection. Istus leaned her head against his shoulder, a simple, trusting gesture that spoke volumes. Arthur wrapped an arm around her, holding her close. He looked out at the vast, sprawling land that had once seemed so empty and hostile. It no longer felt that way. It was just land, waiting for hands to give it purpose. He had been a man lost in the wilderness of his own sorrow, and a woman with no memory had found him. She had saved his farm, yes, but it was a small thing in the end. She had rebuilt his life. She had shown him that even after the most devastating loss, a new harvest was possible. Here, on this small patch of earth, under the vast and watchful sky, they had found their own quiet redemption. They had found their home.